In our project, Cindy and I looked into the importance of user-centered design and what makes a design quote unquote good or bad in the eyes of the user. Moreover, we looked into the field of HCI, why this field is relevant for users, and what the future of HCI is both in academia and in industry. To get expert feedback, we interviewed James Shi, a Northwestern alum who was a previous UI/UX design intern at Shout Networking. This is an app that helped tourists in foreign countries find fellow travelers. Now he's a product designer at IBM. We also interviewed Michael Horn, a professor at Northwestern University with a joint appointment in computer science and learning science. His research includes the design of simple programming languages for use in science museums and classrooms. And his other areas of research include education and learning technologies, among other topics.
Graphic design, UI is a lot closer to. It's about, like, I guess, creating like a consistent visual language for the user to interface with, like giving it, like helping set expectations is a big part of it, making the app more usable. Like, for example, using a really easy example is buttons generally have primaries, secondaries, and tertiary versions. This is decided, like what they look like is decided by the UI designer. And what that means is, like, a primary button is going to be a primary call to action. If like you have a very consistent design language, or like a visual language, and like the user can see a primary button on the page, that's probably going to be like, if they're not thinking, then they're going to click that. So like that's like why like UI is important. It's important to make the app feel more usable, make things more intuitive, etc. UX is a lot more about the actual flow, like what the user is doing as they go through the application. And it's a lot more of what you think of when you talk about like product design or like design thinking. UX is a lot closer to that. You can also think of UX and UI as like micro and macro. UX is the higher level view of like how an application functions, and UI is more like a micro-centered view of like how the user, like how information is transmitted to the user, like in the flow that, like, you know, the UX designer has put it down. Okay. In terms of human-computer interaction, I understand that that's a lot more of like a research field. It's closer to UX than UI. I don't think like graphics is a big part of it. It's a lot more about like how humans interface with computers, but like computers as like a very broad, like there's like a very basic definition that I don't actually know. Like I need, like, a lot of things are considered computers, just a lot of things are considered machines. And understanding, like, I guess how users what users are expecting to like see, like when they, or like do when they interface with certain things, like, or like how computers like can affect the way that users interface with like applications and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know too much about HCI.
No worries. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I guess my other question, kind of going off that, is what is like the human, or either just the overall design process, and especially like user experience design, the whole process of, like, you know, iterating from getting user feedback, iterating, testing different prototypes, like what does that mean to you to be able to have like a user-centered or user-focused design process?
Yeah. Oh man. I don't want to be too like abstract or whatever when I speak about this kind of stuff, because I hate it when designers do that. It's just like, it's all talk and like concrete examples. But what it means to be human-centered when it comes to UX and UI design is that you start with, I guess, what it's, oh my god, it's about empathy. It's like what everybody says, and like everyone says it because it's true. It's about understanding where the user's coming from, what their goal is. Like from a macro level, is like what are they looking to, like, why are they downloading your application? I guess they're looking to save time, money, etc. All the way down to micro level decisions, like when they come to a like interface. Like, are they looking for specific parts of information? Are they looking to identify certain parts of your application? Are they looking to create a new resource or something? Or like, you know, what, like, I guess what what are they thinking about when they get to the application? How does your interface make them, like, how does that your interface factor into that context? And then like, what's the easiest way to get them from point A to point B? With point A being where they are now, and point B being the value proposition of the product or service as a whole.
Yeah, and how did you? I guess how do you deal with you know, do you find that often there are different ways with different products? There are different ways to get from point A to point B. It's not just like a purely like linear process where it follows a step every time.
Yeah, it's definitely not linear. There's like many different solutions, similar to, I guess, like, I don't know if you took EX 212. That class was hard. Each problem had like a few different ways you could solve it, and I think it's similar to where like there's a like you can know if the answer is wrong, but there's a lot of right answers.
Okay, cool. And then kind of going off that, in your view, what do you think like makes a design either like quote unquote good or bad? Like what factors do you take into account as a product designer, like when you're looking at a product?
It's a really good question. It's a good question because my answer is it depends on the business, which I think is probably a factor of me being in a business-driven company. But a design can look like shit, and users can be super frustrated with it, but it could also work depending on what the business motivation was for that entire thing. Like if the business motivation is to increase like I guess the conversion rate on a page, like locking users into a document or like a specific function could be really annoying to them, but if it increases conversion rate, maybe it's a good design. I don't know, it's hard to say, like everything depends, but ultimately deciding on whether something's a good design or a bad design, you have to take into both business needs and user needs, figure out like whether or not like it's been balanced correctly, I guess, and then make a judgment call. I mean, this stuff's, I guess, pretty subjective when it comes to like good or bad, but those are the two things that you factor.
Okay. And could you give me or give like some examples of like either during your time at IBM or before, like where you either designed or evaluated a product that you thought was, maybe an example of both like a bad product and a badly designed product and a better designed product?
Okay, off the top of my head, there's one that like at a glance. So the idea was to help, the idea for this product was to help users kind of like how you can reserve study rooms like at the core or whatever. You can reserve hardware to run software on. This is for like a supercomputer test team, so they need supercomputers to run their tests. And the system was essentially just a list of the machines with a reserve button you could click to see availability. And that sounds super intuitive. It sounds like it works like a study room and whatnot. But in the context of the user needs, it's actually a terrible design. And the reason is because users will be running, tests are, one, unpredictable, and two, really, really long. And because they're unpredictable, you never know when you actually need to run tests. So it's really hard to reserve in advance. And because they're really, really long, when you do need to run tests, you need for like a 24 to like 2 week, like a very, very large time range slot to like find a reservation. And what that means is if you have a bunch of people, like imagine like 1,000 people like looking for like machines, you being able to find a 2 week time slot on a whim is pretty much impossible. So that's an example of a badly designed system for like the user like needs of that in that area. And the better solution was to take actually that's going to be really, really complicated to explain, but basically I think part of the reason why like that system came up had to do with the fact that machines, like when you need to look for tests, you have to find compatible machines as well as available machines. And a better way to do this was to instead of take like a bunch of like a small group of machines and split availability among them, find like semi non-functional machines that are like have been like dead for a while, revive them to life, and then that guarantees that like you can give this machine to somebody else. It just, instead of reserving, you're like looking for new almost permanent resources to give people. Is like what ended up happening, but that's like, yeah.
Okay. And when you, so I guess going off that, did you how did you, I guess, what was the process of figuring out, you know, what the problem was, what you need to solve, and like as you were going through that process, by the end, were like the users like satisfied, or like how much of a change did they feel in like the usability of the product?
Oh man, you're asking for like a 45-minute presentation.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. It's more of like a time thing. But let me see. How do I explain this really concisely? So the entire project started because of business needs. Basically, the supercomputer test team was growing really quickly, and costs grow when an organization grows, when your revenue grows, but costs are growing proportionally to revenue. Like generally, I don't know if you've heard about like economies of scale, but like just in general across like every single system in the world, as you grow like a resource economy or an economy, generally you also reap benefits of scale, but like that just was not happening. And so admin, it's estimated like 40% of like hardware was like being basically distributed inefficiently. And the current way to do that was through the reservation system. And so that was centered around developers who found it really hard to judge compatibility of systems, which is why they're kind of locked into a list of systems that have been like, I guess, picked out for them. And that's why like the supply was so low. Yeah, I don't think this is going to work. There's a terrible example to explain in like a few minutes, actually.
No, you're good.
So your question was, how did we get from point A to point B?
Yeah. How did you evaluate, or how did you know, how did you evaluate like the product based on like what the user like was thinking or like feeling about the product, and like how did you then respond to, or I guess what was like the process of how you evaluate you evaluating the product and seeing like how well the user was satisfied with the product, basically.
So I'm probably not going to go too deep into what this is. Yeah, I'll explain like a very high level. So you start off with what's called generative research, where there's a lot of different techniques for it, and this is where like researchers generally have a lot of fun. I'm sure like you've heard about like different generative techniques.
Yeah.
You kind of just poke around like the different systems. You like for what we did is we fixated on hardware and kind of mapped out the journey of hardware through the entire ecosystem of IBM. But you could also have done like user journeys for like the different users involved, etc. You kind of figure out where like pain points and like where users are feeling frustrated, or where like there's friction and like hardware handoffs, etc. And then you start to, I guess, try to like get down to the root of the problem, because like there's usually going to be a few issues, but as you dig deeper, usually things become clearer in terms of like, oh, like this one root cause is the reason why like all these different pain points occur, or like you can start to like, I guess, find sources and like trace the issues and the pain points and the friction all the way back to the root problem. And then you look at all the problems that you could be solving and I guess figure out which one would have the biggest impact on your ultimate like goal. So like usually that's a combination of a user goal and a business goal. For us, it was like hardware bloat. We wanted to reduce the total number of hardware in the resource economy, because like there's way too many. I guess like just for a little more context, each system is around $5 million. So even like getting rid of one system is a really big deal. So after that, you start taking pot shots. Really, it's pretty tough to get things right the first time. What we did was we made a bunch of MVPs and we tried to populate them with real data and like kind of send them out into like the atmosphere or whatever. And generally like
What are NVPs?
Minimum viable products.
Right.
For example, one of the ideas we had was to take all the little lists of hardware that had been popping up that developers used to like reserve things, right? Like that's just what I was talking about earlier. It wasn't just one list, it was multiple lists, kind of split up by pods, where like each pod had 2 to 3 teams, and the teams would like pool their resources and create these lists for each person in the pod to reserve from. And our first idea was to take all these pods, take their resources and kind of expose them to everybody to make like one massive like collection, like one massive list. And we did that really, really quickly by just making a basic HTML page with like links to all the different pod like lists. And then we got told to take that down in like 30 minutes. Like it was very, very fast, very, very visceral reaction. But like we got like a million good reasons as to why targeting developers for a solution like that was never going to work. So that was like, it was in the form of like very aggressive messages, but like it was really good research. And like that's like kind of like you basically, the fastest way to get through all like the ideas and all the problems you could be solving is like process of elimination. And so you have to figure out the fastest way to test your concept and then do it and then cross it off usually. Sometimes it works. If it does work, I guess you put it off to the side and keep going. And then after that, you choose the one that has the most impact, the most potential. A lot of that is like based off of conviction, not necessarily like an objective process. Like design is really messy. And then you build it out, and then the process becomes a lot more micro, and you keep doing the same kind of idea where you go generative research, evaluative research, and then like you like reflect, and then you go back to generative research and stuff. But each time like you expand and go back in, you kind of go shorter and shorter, and then like eventually you get to an actual end solution.
Okay.
And that's it. Yeah.
And so where do like where are the reins handed off from like the designers to the developers? Is it like when you finally do the developers, do they try to build out each iteration, or only when you come up with the final solution is that when they get involved and start building out whatever product or idea you come up with?
It really depends on the techniques your organization employs. I'll give like an example. For us, it is at the very end. Generally, like these are for like bigger like products or like platforms. So like you finish the design process, you have the final design, then you give it to developers. And throughout the entire thing, you're checking in with developers for like feasibility concerns and whatnot, or like possibilities and stuff. But at organizations, say like Facebook, they can like employ like A/B testing on like their consumers. Like they can like roll out a prototype to like 100 consumers and see like how that like flies past them. I'm sure you've gotten like random features on Facebook before that like your friends don't have. You're like, well, what the fuck is this? Like you're a member of like an A/B test. It's like what that is. So like in that case, then developers would be building out the prototypes as like as the design process rolls on. But
okay. And when you're like doing this kind of like generative research and so forth, you probably have like a budget, like financial constraints and like kind of resource constraints that you're working with. Is that true? And like, if so, does that like change with like different products, like, or is it kind of like a pretty constant amount of resources you guys have?
Yeah, it definitely depends on, again, your organization. We're a very large company, so we have like pretty much no budget. You can do whatever the hell you want. But I would imagine like at a startup or whatever, there's definitely constraints and like what software you can kind of use. But for the most part, like paper prototyping, or like as it is in its digital form these days because of COVID, is like pretty cheap. So budget's not really a constraint. What's more of a constraint is feasibility concerns. Right. Especially you'll see this a lot with designers that don't have technical backgrounds. They'll like come up with like these great ideas that just will never work. And it's very sad. See. But
and you have a technical background as a designer, or you?
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of my developer friends, like, I think it's just a very normal thing for like developers back before COVID, like to get lunch and then just complain about their designers, like asking them to do impossible stuff. Like that's just like a thing.
Yeah.
But
Cool.
yeah.
And yeah, I guess one other question I had was, in your view, like, what do you see as the broader implications of like of a good or bad user-centered design, like not only in terms of like business, but like how just from a bigger perspective, like how do you think how like users and consumers, you know, interact with products overall?
Yeah, I would say just in general over like all industries and all like products and services, design is a long-term investment. Like what it does is it builds trust and like with your users and builds like reliability and loyalty. And sometimes it gives you an edge. Unlike certain cases like Apple, for example, Apple's OS so goddamn buggy. I never download the first version because there's always mistakes with it and like a million updates afterwards. Doesn't matter. Their software sucks though because their experience is so good. Like it's always way easier to use an Apple computer to build anything, just because like the design is better. So sometimes it gives you an edge in cases like that. But for the most part, it's like for other than like cutting edge technology where like design is going to be the edge, it's mostly just like a long-term like investment. Yeah.
And in your experience, like, do you like with the products that you've designed at IBM before, do you see the benefits of good user-centered design initially, or is it kind of something that you kind of have to step back from, or check after working on a couple of projects, you see like the benefit of it maybe like months later or something like that? Like, what is the scale in terms of how impactful you see it is to have a good user-centered design?
You do have to step back. Generally, it'll take a few months to gather any data that like makes your results quantifiable. Sometimes they're a lot faster. For example, like one of the redesigns we just did, like the product I was working on was the core value proposition was centered around forms, like filling out a bunch of forms. And we did a redesign of how the forms flowed to make them a lot more usable, a lot more intuitive, a lot more guided experience. And the conversion rate doubled from like 8 to 16. And before that, it was like 14 down to 10, down to 8, like over like the last 2 years. So we brought it back up to 16. That was like very quick impact, right? Sometimes like on a product like let's say like Olive Cloud, like if you're just looking at IBM Cloud versus Google Cloud versus Microsoft Azure or AWS, the reasons why some providers might switch over like a long period of time might be design centered, might not be. And in that case, it's a lot harder to quantify the impact of design in those cases. And there's a lot of papers and a lot of studies you can like read to like for like designers trying to figure out like how to quantify their results and stuff. But yeah, I don't really have a good answer for situations like that where like it's a lot harder to measure.
Okay, but most of your stuff is more shorter term with rolling out features and stuff. Yeah,
generally there's going to be like a key performance indicator, like a KPI that like you're concerned about, and that is usually a number that you can measure before and after a project. So that does make it pretty easy. But yeah, for products or services as a whole, it's a lot harder.
All right, I can continue. So I took CS330 Intro to HCI with you about 2 years ago. Just curious that there are things that you wish you could have covered in that class but didn't have time.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, my own research is more in the education and learning space, so it would have been nice to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into that dimension of HCI research. There's a whole lot of ethics to talk about around research methodologies, particularly with HCI and sort of building computational systems and kind of the ethics of working with people as research participants, but also thinking about the implications of the technologies that we build. If that makes any sense. I think more in general on research methods. So like mostly what I was doing was teaching HCI from a design perspective, and there wasn't a whole lot about like, okay, how do you actually run user studies of different kinds and like what would that look like? And then, I think just more hands-on experience doing, usability. I think the main reason that students take that course is like, if you're ever on part of a team that's doing UI, UX, like feeling confident as a part of that team and knowing kind of what your roles can be. And I don't, there's just not enough time in a quarter to really dig into that at all.
Yeah. Okay, my next question, going back to your research, why did you choose to work on more on like education interaction side of HCI work?
I mean, it wasn't really a choice. Like I was always interested in education, and I was always interested in sort of designing software systems. So it was never like I woke up and said, what am I going to do? It just sort of was a natural, it was the thing I was doing anyway. So it was, it's like, if I can make a career out of this, I might as well do it because it's what I, love doing.
Yeah. Has your interest or focus changed throughout your past few years or since like you start doing HCI research?
Definitely. I've always kind of had an emphasis on computational literacy, programming, CS education types of topics. And I think I've really started to think about the implications of calling something a literacy. So if you call computational literacy, what does that mean? And some of the implications are that, well, if it's a literacy, it should be something that's accessible to everyone and all disciplines and not just computer science. And so I think that I've been thinking a lot about how CS kind of shapes computational literacy discussions in like terms of engineering and efficiency and optimization and science and research, but it kind of neglects, I think, using computation as like an art form or humanity and so I've been thinking a lot about, ways that we can kind of introduce people to the joyful and creative side of programming and computation. And then also kind of recognizing that, literacies can be used, as tools of oppression and tools of empowerment. And so being kind of conscious about the history of literacy in society. And so those have been shaping, I know this is kind of far afield, but that's been shaping a lot the way that we kind of engage in HCI research, kind of thinking about like, why are we doing this? Why are we building a system to help people learn how to program, for example, and sort of all of the HCI that goes into that, like to what end are we doing that? And so those kinds of considerations, and I think really shape the research in a profound way. And I think that anyone doing HCI research has to ask themselves at some point, why am I doing this particular study or work or design work or whatever it is? And so, yeah, sorry, that's a long answer to a short question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Are there any projects that you're particularly proud of or that you have like most memory about?
Yeah, so I would say the stuff that most recent, like stuff that I'm really proud of is our work at the intersection of music and computational literacy and kind of designing tools that let people create music using programming. And so those kinds of projects I'm really proud of. And some of the designs that I'm in that space were super simple, like just very, like we built a museum exhibit that's just it's hard to describe, but it's a museum exhibit where you put like plastic balls on a table, and those plastic balls make a drum pattern. And it was a very, very simple design, very minimal functionality, but people really, you know, genuinely loved it, and like it was meaningful to them. And so as a designer, creating something that's meaningful to people, that they learn, you know, they have fun, that they get something out of, is a really fulfilling, you know, kind of thing to do.
Yeah, I guess the topic design, why do you think human-centered design is important in HCI work?
I don't think that, I mean, I think we're at a point now where we realize there's no alternative, right? Like if you're not doing human-centered design, you're not really doing
Right.
design. So that's one answer. You can create something, but if you're not putting it out there in the world and seeing how people use it, how people understand it, that's not really design to me. Whatever we build, whenever, you know, anything that we do in my research lab that we build, we expect fully that it's going to fail miserably the first time we try it with anyone, right? So that's kind of the rule. And you go in with the expectation that whatever you spent, you know, hours and hours and hours, days, weeks, months building is going to fail. And you have to prove to yourself and, you know, to your team that no, actually, this is actually working. And then even when you see it working, you're skeptical and you don't believe it's working. And so you make sure you test it with lots and lots of people before you actually start to believe that maybe, you know, maybe this design is functional. So I guess for me, it's, yeah, it's just, that's what design
There's
is.
no other way around.
Yeah, there's no alternative. Now, I do think that increasingly people are thinking about participatory design methods, and I think that that's something really valuable and important to think about, especially in the learning and education space, working closely with teachers, educators, students, learners, and involving them in part, you know, as kind of co-designers is a really important next evolution in design work.
Can you explain what's participatory design a little more?
So participatory design is historically it's tied up with like labor movements in Scandinavian countries in the 70s, but what it's come to mean is that you involve your target audience, whoever you're designing for, you involve them in the actual design process from the ground up. And so that means thinking about like, why are we building this thing, you know, and like making sure. So it's like user-centered design is you try to go and empathize with your target audience. You try to understand them as much as you can. And then you build something for them. And then you test it to make sure that it works the way you thought it was supposed to work, right? Participatory design is, you don't try to design for, you design with. You bring your target audience into the conversation, help them think about the requirements, help them think about why you're building it. And then you still do all the user-centered design, like the testing and all that still has to happen. But the key difference is that you're designing with people that you're, you know, your intended audience as opposed to for.
I see. Interesting. Yeah, so what are some good or bad examples of design you've seen? And what do you think makes a good design?
Okay, but there are many, many examples of bad design. Like, you know, I mean, I don't know. It's hard not to, there's so many examples of bad design, but let me answer the other question about like what I think good design is. You know, good design is something that is as simple as possible without, you know, sacrificing capabilities, power, expressiveness. Good design sort of makes you feel empowered. You know, the tool kind of disappears, like the tool doesn't center itself. Whatever it is that people are trying to accomplish just becomes centered, and the tool sort of fades into the background. Good design is hard work, like every little detail and every like piece, you know, kind of has to fall into place. And, you know, each sound that the design makes, each feeling, each movement, like everything has to be worked on. You know, the good design gives you feedback. Good design gives you like is easy to learn how to use. I think good design, and you know, depending on what it's for, can enable like virtuoso performances, meaning that people can get really good at using something, and that's something we tend to like, I think, forget in sort of a lot of usability work, is that, you know, I think of like an instrument like a violin. A violin it's got terrible UI, right? Like it's really hard to learn how to use. It's super difficult for beginners, but the high end is so high. Like what you can do with the instrument when you're really good at it is amazing. And so I do think that like we sometimes forget about the high end of design, and like what does it mean to make to let people sort of achieve the limits of what they can do as human beings. Yeah, good design thinks about like whole human beings and like all of the abilities that they have. Good design thinks about differences in ability, you know, and sort of recognizes that not everyone, you know, it should be something that's as universal as possible for people to use. Like, so, you know, you can imagine all of this becomes kind of impossible to achieve, but like, these are the elements that you want to be thinking about in good design. Good design is inclusive to the fullest extent possible. You know, there's examples, but you know, like I said, it's very hard. Getting it right is really hard. Getting it wrong is there are many ways to solve a problem badly.
Yeah. So it really seemed like doing the design work, you're always able to iterate more and more. Do you ever think it would come to a point to you that, oh, I think this work is good enough, or I think I would call this work a good design?
Yeah, sure. And there's certainly a risk of overdoing things. Like over designing is something that like can, you know, it's like, oh, let's keep adding like features, or if we just add this little bit. And like sometimes, like that museum exhibit I mentioned, you couldn't set the tempo, you couldn't change the drum sounds, you couldn't, there were no controls at all except for putting the balls on and pausing the music. Like there was no, so like we could have gone on and kept designing, and okay, let's build a slider for people to control the tempo, and like, let's add this and let's add this and let's add this. But at a certain point, that would have been, the complexity would have started to get into the way of the joyfulness of the experience for people. And so there was a real risk of just doing too much design work. And in that case, maybe just stopping with, it's so simple and easy, but people love it, so like, let's just stop there, you know? And so, yeah.
I see. Yeah. So what do you think the future direction of HCI would look like? Or there's some area of HCI that you wish you could have seen more work in?
So the future of HCI, you know, there's a lot of talk right now about like the metaverse and virtual reality and artificial and augmented reality. And I think that the future of HCI is like going to go in that direction for a little longer, but I think the real future is more in intangibility, which is sort of like, and this is my personal bias, but I just think that it's more about embedding computational intelligence into everyday artifacts that we can collaboratively use together than it is going to be about putting on headsets or glasses or sort of removing ourselves from the real world. It's going to be more thickly embedding ourselves in the real world that I think is going to be the real future. We have a long way to go for that, but that's where I think things are going to head.
Yeah, my very few questions. My last question, what are some of your most random design ideas you really want to see to come true? It doesn't have to be related to research or something.
Oh man. Yeah, I have a lot of random design ideas. I have this design idea for like it's a collaborative DJ station where each sample is like a puck, and like each sort of music sample is a puck, and they can be assembled in lots of different ways, and like moving the pucks around the space creates different soundscapes, and that it would be a very much of a multi-user kind of collaborative experience of creating music. There's been similar stuff that's done, but I have some like crazy ideas that like sort of extend existing work. So, I mean, that's just one example.
Do you have more examples?
Yeah, we did a lot of work on, many years ago, we did a lot of work on environmental sustainability. And so one was like some sort of interactive artwork or station that's designed for children that lets them keep track of how a house uses electricity during the day, kind of more in real time. Because right now we still get like our feedback on electricity consumption is like maybe once a month the energy company says, oh, here's how you did this, you know, this month, and we have no idea really like what that means. Like how many kilowatt hours of energy did you use this week?
No idea.
No idea, right? Like, and if I hadn't said kilowatt hours, you probably wouldn't have even like known like what's a unit of energy consumption, like how many, you know, what do you call a bucket of energy? You have no idea. Like people just don't know even how to talk about it, right? And yet this is like one of the most existential problems facing humanity right now, which is like, how do we do a better job of like managing our energy consumption? And we don't even know the first thing about energy. And so I would love to build something for kids in a house that lets them like see how their house is using energy and kind of like be part of the discussion with parents about like what they're doing to use energy and how they can, you know, save energy. I don't know what that looks like, but that was like a